And I met Nitasha when she was a graduate student and she was working in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC Berkeley and then a recent graduate, and she was doing research on South Asian hip hop artists and thinking through the concept of global racial consciousness in hip hop. And so her coming from a perspective very firmly grounded in this kind of race format or race framework, whereas my experience in ethnic studies, at least at that institution, there was no conversations about specific diasporas, about Pacific peoples, even though you could drive 10 minutes and find large Pacific communities in the Bay Area. And so us sort of coming from very different perspectives, both in terms of lived experience, but also thinking through these issues in the academy. Nitasha Sharma is the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence and Associate Professor of African American Studies and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. I've invited her in large part because of her current project, which is an ethnography on Blacks in Hawaii. As I mentioned, her first book, she's the author of Hip Hop Daisy, South Asian Americans, Blackness, and Global Race Consciousness. And so here with her new project on Blacks in Hawaii, thinking about this linkage between the frameworks of race in this place in Hawaii, but also in the larger kind of ethnic studies, moving into an oceanic ethnic studies and thinking through issues around indigeneity. So please help me welcome Nitasha Sharma.
Aloha, how are you? I'm really thrilled to be here. One thing Lisa didn't mention is that I'm born and raised here in Manoa, and I literally grew up on this campus. My mom is in Asian studies for the last 3-4 decades. Mimi Sharma, and my dad passed away. He was in history here for 40 years, I think. Jagdish Sharma. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to everybody who invited me and for making this happen. So to speak about my work on the Black Pacific. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. All right. So I come to the question of race, indigeneity, and ethnicity as somebody from Hawaii, and as somebody who is Indian from India in terms of my dad and Haole. Jeff on the previous panel called himself a recovering political scientist. I consider myself a divorced anthropologist. It's over. Yeah. And I'm now happily located in U.S. ethnic studies, so African American studies and Asian American studies in Chicago at Northwestern. So the claims that I'm going to work through here today come from an ethnography that I'm writing on Blacks in Hawaii. I interviewed 51 people of African descent here, non-military U.S. I wanted to look at residents. Blacks are an understudied group in the islands, despite their lengthy history and growing numbers. And my project articulates what Blacks can tell us about community, race, indigeneity, and belonging. What does the Pacific offer to people of African descent who often describe Hawaii as an alternative to continental racism? How do the island's history, local culture, and sovereignty movements inform their experiences? And what racial frameworks do Blacks from the continent bring with them to help us better understand island dynamics? The lives and options of today. So mostly what I'm going to talk about today are theoretical concepts, and I'm going to read. So I'm going to flip it up. So I hope that's fine, and I'm not going to actually talk too much about my research, and I'm happy to talk about it more. And the folks that I'm drawing from today are those people that I interviewed who are Black Hawaiian moms, and African American, with almost without exception, African American fathers, but the dads were not here. Okay? So the lives and options of today's Black Hawaiians, who I interviewed, who, like I said, had Black fathers, Hawaiian mothers, reveal the intersection of colonial Hawaiian and U.S. racialist pasts, the politics of Hawaiian sovereignty and Black power movements, and the rise of hip-hop along the renaissance of Hawaiian expressive forms. Today I'm going to focus less on my research and address the broader questions of this panel, which I think are really important questions. I'm going to discuss first the limits of an ethnicity paradigm, and then turn to 3 ways that I see race as working in the islands, drawing examples from my work, and I'll wrap up with some comments on the relation, something that Vince had commented on before, kind of the tense ties between Native studies and ethnic studies in the U.S., okay? So a focus on Black Hawaiians reveals, Black Hawaiian relations reveals how race commingles with indigeneity to disrupt disrupt the predominant paradigms of culture and ethnicity. Understanding the multivalence of the Pacific, including the lives of blacks and the political economy of resource distribution here, requires us to move beyond ethnicity's focus on self-identification, culture, and group interests. An ethnicity-only lens obfuscates the role of power and unequal access to resources like land, education, jobs, that play out based on dominant groups' practices and ideologies about their others. And one point, of course, to notice is that the dominant group is not always white, right? Despite scholars' attempts to deploy ethnicity with explanatory power for unequal group relations, the co-optation of ethnicity by post-racial multiculturalism and in tourist brochures flattens out difference, equating groups as culturally different, food, dance, clothing, right, in a horizontal rather than vertical fashion. This includes the ethnicization of Kanaka Maoli, that is referring to Hawaiians as just another ethnic group alongside Japanese, Filipinos, etc. And this is part of the process that's described in Shona Jackson's work on Guyana. And I'd love us in the Q&A or in the ending roundtable to talk about what we can learn from Caribbean island studies too, right? So Shona Jackson, who studied Guyana, writes, quote, that a continued identification of indigenous peoples in terms other than those in which they see themselves and consequently relate to the land represents their real and figurative displacement, right? So applying an ethnic paradigm to Native Hawaiians is specifically problematic because, as UH graduate Brandon Ledward states, talking about Hawaiians as simply another ethnic group tends to negate their indigenous claims to land and government in Hawaii. It also, Shona Jackson continues, reflects attempts to not necessarily disappear indigenous peoples, but to subvert the radical difference they represent. So Jody Bird in Native Studies levels a similar critique of ethnicity's equating of various groups that have, in fact, critical differences. In a twofold move, ethnicity hides power differentials among groups, such as including settler native binary, and it obfuscates the racial and state power not just of whites, but also of non-white groups in positions of power. The ethnicity paradigm is part of a process of, another quote, how those brought in as forced labor, as racialized capital, right, blacks and Indians, for instance, to the Caribbean, Canada, and the Pacific, how they now contribute, or we now contribute to the disenfranchisement of indigenous people. Race, on the other hand, takes into account such power, history, and inequality. Are you all with me? Not necessarily what I'm saying, but you're here? You're awake? Okay. Okay, so race is relevant to Hawaii, the Hawaii context in at least 3 ways. The first is the process of racialization, and I think what I'm doing today is spelling out a lot of my definitions, okay? So racialization, the ideological process by which dominant groups categorize others based on phenotype and then develop ideas that they impute onto those bodies. Racism, and I like to disarticulate race from racism, by extension employs these ideologies of the other in order to justify their domination for the privilege of those in power, okay? So whites and others have racialized blacks and Hawaiians differently. By blacks, I mean people of African descent, and I'm primarily focusing on African Americans. So blacks and Hawaiians have been differentially racialized and in overlapping ways over time in Hawaii. Initially, blacks who came on whaling ships to the islands as early as 1790 were welcomed, and some learned Hawaiian and formed families with Hawaiian women. These were black men. Their children were considered and categorized as Hawaiian. However, the stereotypes of black male hypersexuality and criminality developed since slavery have attached themselves to black soldiers who came to Hawaii, and they often framed locals' ideas of blacks, including black locals who grew up without black families. The distinct racialized sexualization of Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders as feminized, welcoming, and content natives, right, were similarly used to justify the colonization of the kingdom, followed by militarization and tourism. Such stereotypes are cross-racially adopted, right, and have influenced the mutual attraction of Hawaiian mothers and black fathers of the black Hawaiians I interviewed. Blacks and Hawaiians have been differentially racialized, but they've also experienced overlapping racialization. So Noenoe Silva has critically illustrated Howley's expropriation of black stereotypes onto Hawaiian royalty, such as depicting the queen as a pikanini and other kind of cartoon images in order to racialize and discredit the monarchy. History also reveals the intersection of racialization and indigeneity. I know I have a lot of words. Colonists depicted Hawaiians and other indigenous people as peoples unfamiliar with effective capitalist modes of production and subjected them to genocide in order to materially dispossess them, so to get the land, so that people were in the way of the land. By contrast, blacks have been central to U.S. labor needs, as Asians have been on plantation Hawaii, and were thus subjected to the one-drop rule in order to increase their integer. Thus, Hawaiians as indigenous peoples and blacks as a racialized group face distinct material processes and mechanisms of control. Okay, so this leads to my second use of the concept of race. My second use of race refers to the importation of U.S. blood-based illogics that have been applied to and then adopted by blacks and Hawaiians and all of us, right? So the one-drop rule of hypodescent that I mentioned was developed in order to expand slave holdings. And it states basically that if you're part black, you're black, right? So that the offspring of slave masters with slaves, female slaves, would become slaves, right? Thomas Jefferson, you know. So this thinking continues now as when blacks who acknowledge their multiple ancestries are told, come on, if you're black, then if you're part black, then you're black, right? We see this with a lot of discussion of Obama, and we can talk about Obama some other time, right? In the case of Kanaka Maoli, the importation of racialized logic, as you of course know, includes the blood quantum rules that regulate who is and who is not Hawaiian enough to own homestead land. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act designated that Native Hawaiians are defined as individuals having at least 50% Hawaiian blood. So blood quantum logic has led both Hawaiians and blacks, despite their multiple ancestries, to often highlight their Hawaiianness or blackness. Or as Brandon Ledward says again, quote, rather than playing up our many ethnicities in his dissertation on Hawaiians, oftentimes most of us choose to posture ourselves as simply Hawaiian. However, if in practice, right, both black and Hawaiian communities engage in the much more elastic practices of belonging, these continental ideologies of race nonetheless hold ground, both materially, such as access to land, and ideologically, so debates over who is and isn't black or Hawaiian enough in Hawaii. So my third deployment of race refers not just to these imposed and oppressive processes of dispossession and exploitation, but now to a process of meaning-making or an empowered articulation of resistance by what I'm going to use an old school term, people of color, against oppression. So how do we, right, also create race in ways that are not just to say black is beautiful, but also in very meaningful, powerful ways that have political meanings as well. So Hawaiian activists recount the influence of black struggles in the 1960s, which is a great example of this reclamation and use of race as empowering. I'm not so bent on thinking about the future as a raceless future. Perhaps it's because I lack imagination. I'm very about today, right? And also because I think that race can be a very important, empowering tool. I don't think we need to get rid of differences. I think the question is how do we create solidarities and coalitions around them, okay? So Hawaiian activists recounted the influence of black struggles of the 60s upon local demands for sovereignty, demilitarization, and representation. So Haunani K. Trask says that when she was a student at the University of Wisconsin in the 60s, through the mid-70s, the Vietnam War, she said, writes, focused a great deal of our organizing and protest. The Black Civil Rights Movement came also to define our resistance, as did one of its offshoots, the Fight for Black Studies program, she writes. So the development of ethnic studies here and later Hawaiian studies at UH follows the rise of black studies across the nation. Students and community members across the US were invested in exposing institutional power and increasing the numbers of underrepresented minorities on campus. They were also invested in mental decolonization as well. So Haunani K. Trask incorporated black thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Malcolm X in her courses. But despite the importance of these anti-colonial black thinkers, the position of African Americanists here at UH has been totally in flux, as you also know. And I think we can't understand ethnic studies or Hawaii without understanding blacks and black people. Speaking to a number of comments that have been made, we have to understand the black experience. The Black Power movement and movements in Hawaii for representation and rights reveal that despite the limits of an identity-based organizing, that impedes broader coalitional or future-based politics. Race is also an axis around which to forge community, to resist oppression, and organize for rights. So in this way, race operates in the islands in response to group oppression and denigration, and it's articulated through identity-based activism and pride linked to cultural expressions of peoplehood. Okay, my last section. Everybody all right? I like the little call and response, but I'm not getting any. But I see, it's okay. Okay, so now about Native studies and Black studies, settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, real brief, okay? Although solidarity and coalitional politics are passé for some, I don't know what's going on with the graduate students where I'm at, but they say like coalitions suck, solidarity is so played out. And I'm like, well, what is, okay, so call me played out and sucky, okay? So although some are saying that it's passé, and I'm curious to see what are they talking about, what are they putting in its place, right? I continue to look at the overlapping histories, experiences, and politics across non-white groups in order to imagine a better future for all peoples, okay? But we still have to contend with our differences and divisions. So this brings me to my final section. There's rising academic interest in the US and Canada in the relationship between Black studies and Native studies that foregrounds settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. Some scholars have articulated overlapping histories of oppression in order to cultivate shared visions of self-determination as people of color. Others describe Blacks and Indigenous peoples as discrete groups not accounting for mixed ancestries, and they describe competitive and tense relations, right? They ask, what is the relationship of formerly enslaved peoples to settler colonialism, right? Blacks as settlers. How has U.S. ethnic studies' primary focus on slavery and Black suffering contributed to the erasure of Native peoples? Others have critiqued Indigenous demands for sovereignty as anti-Black and ignorant of the Black radical tradition. On the other hand, Indigenous anti-Blackness has manifested in Native people's participation in slavery, adoption of racist ideas, and denial of African ancestry, or the ostracization of people who have Black ancestry. So what these various perspectives highlight is the weakness of any single approach, ethnicity only, race only, Indigenous only, to group dynamics in settler colonies. That means what I'm saying is that we have to do the really tough intellectual research and of course community work that really pull these things apart and then see how they play together. Most of these discussions center on the continental US, where Blacks are the predominant American minority and Indigenous peoples are often relegated to the past and are under-recognized in both mainstream and in US ethnic studies with its focus on race. Turning to Hawaii, where Kanaka histories are known and their presence felt, Blacks remain unknown, as are their experiences with repression. The Black Hawaiians I spoke with faced anti-Blackness in their families and in broader communities and described being denigrated, denied, ostracized for their Blackness, in contrast to their Hapaholi cousins. They've also experienced the wholesale erasure of Blacks from the history of the islands, civilian Blacks. Obama is not the first Black Islander, right? While recounting how African Americans disregard their Native ancestry. Yet Hawaii also offers African Americans a respite from continental racism and a place to re-indigenize themselves. So a lot of the African American transplants who come to the islands, when I say, what are you, they recount their multiple ancestries, including European and Native and African. Whereas on the mainland, they say, I'm just Black. Okay? We can read anti-Blackness among Hawaiians as a symptom of colonial oppression, that mechanism by which Blacks and Hawaiians are linked through enduring forces of racism and ongoing colonialism. Hawaii is thus a Pacific site where culture and ethnicity are not the only ways that people understand themselves. Black Hawaiians negotiate Black and Kanaka communities whose struggles, histories, and futures are not just geographically separate. So Blacks are not just on the mainland, Hawaiians are not just in Hawaii. And they're not just politically distinct. So Blacks and Hawaiians have particular histories and are fighting for particular futures, but they are also overlapping. Politics and culture cannot be neatly divided into Blacks, politics, race on this hand, Natives, culture, indigeneity on this hand. These are not bounded groups, as we know that a majority of African Americans have Indigenous ancestry and that many Indigenous people have African ancestry. We can maintain the specificity of Kanaka indigeneity rather than as another ethnic group while also analyzing how Hawaiians have been racialized through colonization and ongoing forms of disenfranchisement. So that is, race and indigeneity are distinct identity, legal, historical, and material categories that at times overlap in important ways. While domestic and international legal pursuits for self-determination require the distinction of Indigenous peoples as the category from American racial minorities, Native peoples in North America, like enslaved blacks, have long been racialized to justify Western settlement and expansion. Through the examples of Black history in Hawaii, Black Hawaiians, and the cross-fertilization of political and cultural movements, we see how Blackness and Hawaiianness, race and indigeneity, native settler, intersect, parallel, and overlap in ways that contest binary pairings and that push us beyond the paradigm of ethnicity. Mahalo.